One of the very significant outcomes of the Treaty of Westphalia and its dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire was the rise of the Hohenzollern dynasty in what became the state of Prussia and the changing nature of the Hapsburg dynasty in the Austrian Empire. So the Treaty of Westphalia essentially took the Holy Roman Empire, which I have drawn very well right here. And there's these 300 little states and principalities and duchies, etc., all over the Holy Roman Empire. And they essentially became autonomous, although there remained a Habsburg Holy Roman Emperor, and he, of course, was still a pretty powerful dude. And so up here in kind of like the northern part, there is this little duchy called Prussia and this little territory called Brandenburg. They had both had a very, very rough time of it during the 30 Years' War, and in 1640 became the possession of Frederick William of the Hohenzollern family, and so he reestablished the Hohenzollern dynasty there. And then down here in the southern part, this is kind of the land of the Hapsburgs, and they expanded their territory kind of out this way into the Austrian Empire. Frederick William is a pretty interesting fellow. He had a really rough childhood that was marred by the violence of the 30 Years' War. The territory that he came to inherit, namely Brandenburg and the Duchy of Prussia, was very badly hit in that war. Their towns and cities were devastated. It was never economically strong to begin with and kind of got wrecked during the war. Its army was weak and inadequate in very many respects to the task and relied heavily on the soldiers that fought in the private employ of noblemen in the area, and still private armies in that regard. And so this is what Frederick William comes into when he inherits his land. He was a really well-educated young man. He had spent many years of his young adulthood and his maybe teenage years in the Dutch Republic, and he had a very close association with the Dutch royal family, and he had been educated in the Calvinist faith, and he was very deeply a devout Calvinist. And so we'll see in a moment how his religion played into his policy decisions, because his the territories that he inherited were not Calvinist but were Lutheran. So he's the great elector. Elector meaning that originally in the time period of the Holy Roman Empire, the Hohenzollern family was one of the very prominent families. There were 7 of them who elected the emperor. So know that they were a very prominent family going back into the Middle Ages. Here's a portrait of Frederick William and his family. Now, he was a very savvy guy, and he comes to power, and he started to really work on consolidating his authority and his territory, pulling together Prussia and Brandenburg and another duchy called Pomerania under his own sovereignty, his own rule. Now, this is not something that was easily done, and he saw it as the best way to remedy the many problems faced by these territories. And because he was an absolutist, this kind of suited his own personal political beliefs as well. He understood he wasn't going to have an easy row ahead of him, and so he went about really being quite forceful, especially with his nobility. He very aggressively taxed them. He set about building an army loyal to him and loyal to the state. The army was a terrible deficiency of Brandenburg, Prussia after the war, but he disbanded all the privately held troops of the noblemen and reconstituted an army loyal to him. And he invested heavily in this army, in their training, and in their skill. He pursued sound economic policy. He's invested in infrastructure within his territory, and he also invested in creating an efficient bureaucracy in Brandenburg, Prussia. And so here's his little family. The eldest son you see to the left is his son Frederick, and we'll talk a little bit more about him later. He was a tough dad, and he was so focused on the military. He adopted all these military values himself. He really infused the Prussian society with military values. So we had lots of focus on the military and the training of the military and parades, etc. He required extensive training of his son and was pretty hard on him. Things like in the very, very bitter cold of the German winter, making him stand outside for hours without a coat or gloves, made him spend many, many hours a day in his studies, and was actually so stern, so severe, that his son, the Crown Prince, ran away. Well, he's not a Crown Prince because Frederick William is a duke, not a king, so please forgive me. His heir there actually ran away with the help of his tutor to England, but he was brought back in pretty short order, and things did not go so well for the tutor who masterminded the escape. But he was serious about his responsibilities and about his duties, and his son came around to the idea he needed to be serious about his as well. Here's a map of Brandenburg, Prussia, and it kind of shows how they expanded. Marriage originally between the duchies of Prussia and Brandenburg, and were able through diplomacy and sometimes the spoils of war to accumulate other territories. But this is Prussia becomes a very important state. It was not a monarchy during the life of Frederick William, the Great Elector, but it's very important to note that he is the one who laid the foundations for it to be so. The Prussian army was perhaps the most singular focus of Frederick William. He understood how important this was. Ironically, he tried very hard not to use this army as he grew it and as he trained it, and they became a very respectable fighting force in Europe during the time. And Frederick William did engage his troops in numerous conflicts. There were wars aplenty in the late 17th century, and they performed well, generally speaking. They were impressive. They did a good job. But he did focus on training. He focused on recruiting the best soldiers that he could find. He even very famously had a regiment called the Potsdam Giants, and this was made up of some of the tallest men from all over Europe who he had recruited into this special force. But he really pursued a policy of not using them. He was investing so much money in the army as it was. He did not want to take on the additional expense of war. Okay, but a strong monarch, a strong state, needs a strong army, and Frederick William invested in that heavily. He also built infrastructure for his army that benefited his economy, and he built a very efficient bureaucracy, which is almost exclusively devoted to the army. The Junker class, that word that you see here, is pronounced Junker, and the Junkers are the German Prussian nobility. So this is the noble class. They enjoyed many privileges and a great deal of power in Prussia and Brandenburg and these related territories at this time. And in fact, one of the big jobs that Frederick William had if he was going to establish a monarchy was to subdue the nobility. They hadn't even started yet. And so he made really, really fast inroads with this. Frederick William was, confrontational with the Junker class. If they didn't want to pay a tax, he kind of dared them not to. Break my law, break what I have set out. I have my new little army behind me. He disbanded their armies and prohibited them from reforming one of their own. And eventually he struck a deal with them, essentially an agreement that ended up working out very well for Frederick William in the end. He essentially promised to the younger class that on their own land, and these land holdings would have been extensive, that they were the, ruler of the roost, that what they said went. It's important to note that these territories, places like Prussia and Pomerania and Brandenburg at this time, still had legal serfdom, and he allowed the Junkers to keep their serfs, to be the lord of their serfs. But when it came to the bigger picture stuff, when it came to foreign policy, when it came to taxation, when it came to other matters of the law, that the Junkers would recognize the sovereignty of Frederick William and his heirs in exchange for kind of getting to be the lord of their own manor as it was. He also promised to them the best positions in his government and the important positions of officers within the army. And so these positions in Prussia were exclusively filled by members of the younger class. And so he kind of goes the opposite route of Louis XIV with his nobility. He keeps them very close. He keeps them in the best places. And this worked out very well for him because he earned their loyalty through it. He earned their loyalty to him, and their support of him as essentially an absolutist, and their support of his son in the role of an absolute monarch. And so Frederick William subdues the Junkers, subdues his nobility through their cooperation, essentially, through their cooperation. Domestically, otherwise, I mentioned a few moments ago that Frederick William was a Calvinist. The people of his territories, however, were pretty strongly Lutheran, and he respected that. He didn't impose Calvinism upon them, and so he was much more tolerant of religious diversity, I guess, than other absolutists were. He's a little bit of an exception to that, being in the minority religion himself. And while Lutheranism was the official religion of his domains, he himself remained a Calvinist, and he did not persecute Calvinists. And in fact, when Louis XIV issued the Edict of Fontainebleau in France, revoking the Edict of Nantes, Frederick William welcomed the Huguenot refugees to Prussia. They were, a few thousand of them came. So official religion, but didn't persecute minority religions within his state. He pursued a high-tax, mercantilist style of economy, and very importantly, invested in infrastructure to enable a higher level of trade by the Prussians. Even though it was kind of mercantilistic in spirit, in that they pursued the favorable balance of trade, etc., Prussia did not acquire any colonies during this time. When Frederick William died in 1688, he left a respectable state for his son Frederick to inherit. He had acquired land, he had consolidated his authority, he had subdued the younger class through their cooperation, he had built a very respectable army. Pretty impressive guy, very politically savvy. Something else I want to mention about him is he was very much attuned to the politics of the day, and he hitched his wagon, if you will. He formed alliances with whatever king or state suited his needs at the time, and he wasn't afraid to change or to break those alliances when it was in the best interest of Prussia. And so in so doing, he really practiced balance of power diplomacy, because he very often tended to side with the weaker nation against the stronger one. And he was in alliance with the British and with the Austrians in the War for Spanish Succession, which actually started in earnest after he died. But in recognition of the excellent contribution of the Prussian troops in the War for Spanish Succession, the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold of the House of Habsburg recognized Frederick as the first king of Prussia, allowed him the title of king, and so the Prussian state was born with Frederick as its king, due, of course, primarily to the successful work of his father. And as we shall see, Prussia will go on to become a dominant state in 18th century Europe. So the Habsburgs went about consolidating the territory that they directly controlled. This is in the aftermath of the Peace of Westphalia, and in expanding their empire, gaining new territory under their direct control, etc. And they were quite successful at this. So this is Emperor Leopold I, the first Habsburg Emperor of Austria, as we say now. He was also the Holy Roman Emperor, but his more important title would have been the Emperor of Austria. Interesting looking fella here. Very much a power player still on the world stage, an important participant in the War for Spanish Succession in the early 1700s. But before that, of course, had to deal with the Ottoman Turks again, because this is something every Habsburg has to kind of cut their teeth on. And in the late 17th century, with the help of the Prussian army, the kind of fledgling and growing Prussian army, was able to defeat an attempted siege of Vienna by the Ottoman Turks. And this was a pretty spectacular victory for the Habsburgs. In what is called the Treaty of Karlowitz, they gained a significant amount of territory from the war, most of it from the Ottoman Empire. They really cut into the Ottoman Empire, but you can see in the purple and pink, these areas right here, that they received quite a bit of territory out of the Ottoman Empire, and they expanded their empire to the south and to the east. As the emperors of the Austrian Empire, they moved their home, their official home, if you will, from Prague, which is up here, to Vienna, their new imperial city. This little territory of Silesia, right up here, you notice with the purple and the yellow, it was essentially divided between, shared by, however you want to think about it, Prussia and Austria. And as we shall see, they did a good deal of fighting over that in the 18th century. This is a photograph of the Hapsburg Palace in the imperial city of Vienna. Beautiful place. And they moved their imperial capital to Vienna to signify their consolidation of the Austrian Empire. The Austrian Empire, if you go back to the Treaty of Karlowitz and this vast expansion of territory, came to encompass a number of different ethnicities and nationalities. And this is a difficulty, and always was a difficulty for the Habsburgs, but it's something that for many, many years they handled with great success. The Habsburgs were very much people of ceremony. They maintained a very large, very powerful army. The House of Habsburgs, the state, was quite wealthy and quite powerful. Very staunchly Catholic, absolutely pursued religious uniformity and utter devotion to the Catholic Church. And they were really excellent at their own self-promotion as being the grand symbols of their empire, the leaders of their people, and promoting that image. And so even though their empire was quite diverse in terms of nationality and ethnicity, etc., many different people who spoke many different languages, etc., they were able for many, many years to very successfully unite that empire, unite those people under devotion to themselves. So the Habsburgs themselves became very powerful symbols within their own empire.